Pandesal Forum here. This is a very unique session here at 83-year-old Kamuning Bakery Cafe. This is in cooperation with Philbrick Strategic Studies. The topics for today, of course, it's the biggest headline news in the past few, I think 2 weeks, almost every day, the biggest news, the Ukraine crisis, its lessons and implications for Asia and even for the Philippines. We have 4 distinguished panelists whom I will call one by one to give their opening statement. Then we'll open the floor for questions from our media friends. Later on, we'll call one by one Herman Laurel of the Philbrick Strategic Studies. He's the president, and also former Senator Nikki Coseteng, educator, respected educator, and nationalist former legislator. And we have Professor Ana Malindog Uy, political and geopolitics analyst and columnist. And then, last but not the least, we have Adolfo Paglinawan or Ado Paglinawan, director of Philbrick Strategic Studies, former Philippine diplomat in Washington, D.C., and a geopolitics and politics analyst, radio host. We'll start with Mr. Herman Laurel, more known as Ka Mentong, radio, TV host, analyst, and nationalist intellectual, president of Philbrick Strategic Studies. Mr. Laurel, for your opening statement about the Ukraine crisis.
Okay, magandang umaga po sa lahat, sa ating mga guest resource persons and former Secretary Alma De Leon, if I remember the name correctly. Magandang umaga po at importante po ito dahil apektado po ang ating landas dito sa Asia at sa Pilipinas dito sa nangyayari sa tinatawag na heartland ng Europa. Ang Europa po ay dapat mas malawak ang konsepto natin, yung Eurasian landmass po yan. And it's been 30 years after the fall of the USSR, the Soviet Union, and 25 years after a very significant American document. Anong dokumento ito? Ito yung Project for a New American Century, yung Vision of America written by Robert Kaplan, and well, I remember, I'll mention the name a bit later, na mapping out the future of the world under US leadership, to put it positively, or US domination, to put it negatively. Yan po rin ang vision ng late Brzezinski ng US State Department. So yan po ang dahilan kung bakit nangyari yung 9/11, September 9/11 terror attack, war on terror, attack on Afghanistan, which we see 20 years later, still had its after effects. Attack on Iraq. Both countries had nothing to do with the 9/11 September terror attack on New York, but they used that as an excuse to launch their new Pearl Harbor and their attack on the world. So ito pong essential concept ng Project for a New American Century by Billy Crystal and Robert Kaplan. By the way, Robert Kaplan is the husband of Victoria Nuland, who in 2014 at the Maidan rebellion doon sa Kiev, sa Ukraine, she was with the US State Department and she was overruling the US ambassador there and roaming the streets distributing candies and cookies to demonstrators, which shows the direct hand of the Americans in the 2014 ouster of President Yanukovych, who was balancing the West and the East. Because 2014, the Maidan revolt or regime change project was essential is essential up to today in the restoration of American global hegemony. We will go into that. I submitted a paper to Wilson for distribution to our media, and
thank you.
I have 10 minutes now, so I'm trying to follow our schedule. And
thank you very much.
I stated here what we geopolitically conscious Filipinos, of which our media should be the most interested, are witnessing on the European, or more comprehensively, the Eurasian continent playing out in the border of Ukraine and Russia. What we see here is the heartland theory of Sir Halford Mackinder, which the West and the United States is following with a slight updating. The heartland theory posits that whoever controls Eastern Europe will control the world. And the update of this is whoever prevents one power from controlling the heartland preserves the world for another vision of the world, the multipolar, now new world order in the 21st century. So unipolar world versus multipolar world. Ang Amerika gusto nila unipolar world, sila lang ang power. And by the way, NATO, as the former ambassador to Russia during the time of the USSR, Jack Matlock said, the NATO is there to keep Russia out, to keep Germany down, and to keep the US in Europe. Okay, we will go into that in a while. In 2014, Ukraine still had the political leadership, President Yanukovych, that was trying to balance between US and the Western powers on the one side and Russia on the other. The Maidan regime change operation used racist neo-Nazi forces to set up a US puppet regime, which is still in power today, and used these regimes to harass Russia in the east of Ukraine, pressure Crimea and Russia in general. To restore Putin's Russia has been preparing for the past 2 decades to free itself from total dependence on the European market, which still buys the majority of its natural gas. But since the last decade, Russia has signed the Power of Siberia 1 with China, and this past January, the Power of Siberia 2. These are pipelines that will be supplying billions of cubic meters of natural gas to Europe, ideally, and China. But with the second major pipeline, the Power of Siberia, to open to China, the Russia is prepared to replace the European gas market with the Chinese gas market. That is why there is confidence with Putin that he will be able to succeed in these latest maneuvers. In Asia, the US has used the Philippines as its Ukraine in the South China Sea through the EDSA 1 regime change operation, ousting a fledgling geopolitically independent economic development and modernization-oriented government, and imposing an anti-development, liberalizing, deregulating, and privatizing regime, or regimes as several followed the first Aquino regime, until President Rodrigo R. Duterte changed the equation. President Duterte sinks the U.S. pivot to Asia by reversing the course of events from between China and the Philippines, from mutually defeating conflict and destabilization of Asia as a whole towards mutually beneficial dialogue, cooperation, and trade, thereby stabilizing the Asian region for continuing economic construction and prosperity. Filipinos should begin to comprehend and assist in building the one world, one family vision that the recently ended Beijing Winter Olympics exalted as its closing message. Still, there are some of what I call American Manchurian candidates and officials seeking to restore U.S. warmongering. It's now 10:12, so I think I have two minutes more. So I want to elaborate just a little more. The unipolar world project of the US had two major moves this past 2.5 or maybe even 3 decades already. The war on terror, of course, was there, but that's in the background now since we're focused on Ukraine. The 2014 Maidan revolt against a balancing government of Yanukovych. That was one. And the other was in Asia. And that was the pivot to Asia. The US, the United States, perceiving that it was essential now for it to move 60% of its military forces to Asia to counter China and suppress China's rise. China's vision is not a unipolar world for itself. It has kept on repeating the past 10 years. Its vision is a community of shared future for mankind and a multipolar world against the multipolar world. So I think this study of ours today and discussion about Ukraine and Russia's recognition of Donbass, of Donetsk and Luhansk, and the negotiation for the new borders, is concerns Russia's maybe 4 points. Number one, preservation of Russia's independence and sovereignty, which the U.S. and NATO hopes to also vanquish eventually. And this is the important point that I should not miss to mention that this vanquishing of Russia is essential to the ultimate strategic goal of the unipolar world project of the United States. Because the United States cannot confront China while Russia is not under its thumb. And it is not foreseeable that Russia will yield because now China and Russia are together in a partnership, not a military alliance, mind you, important to mention that, but just a partnership. A partnership based on genuine, real common interest and a common goal of achieving a multipolar world. I'm sure there will be many other aspects I have not touched on since 10 minutes is not enough. It takes a book to elaborate on this. But I'll leave it at that and I'll listen to our other resource persons and we can discuss the questions in the open forum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Herman Laurel of Field Brick Strategic Studies. Later on, we have a lot of questions for you and the others. Next, we'd like to call on former Senator Nikki Cosseteng for her opening statement about the Ukraine issue.
Thank you, Wilson. Thank you, Wilson, and good morning to you and to everyone in this forum. Also to all our listeners and viewers. The last several weeks has been quite trying as far as I'm concerned, because I see the problems that are going to blow up in Eastern Europe, not as something that is not confined only to Eastern Europe. Even if we are several thousand miles away, we definitely are going to feel this tsunami of repercussions. And it really is mind-boggling the way the United States and its allies over the past several decades, let's just look at after World War II, has managed to create unnecessarily problems, imagined or real, in different parts of the world, thereby creating a lot of destabilization, a lot of destruction. And sometimes you wonder, on one side, they will say they're out there to preserve democracy and freedom. And on the other side, they're there to, debilitate and destabilize different governments all over the world. We know this because of, as we all know, the presence of thousands of military installations of the United States. We know this because they manage to be everywhere, and the so-called enemies are nowhere near them. So that alone, you can see that kind of an attitude, which I don't really, which I consider a balance of terror that they would like to create, so-called terror. So we wonder really why seemingly the United States does not allow individual countries and cultures to flourish in their own turf, and they would be there to mess up things. Sometimes you wonder why really, why does this great interest in the Ukraine? I'd like to see it for a large part because of the resources that Ukraine has in its territory. The coal reserves are a good maybe 200 to 400 years of coal reserves. Considering that they have less than 1% of the world's population, they have this much resources. They have like 27 billion tons of iron ore, which is definitely a resource that not very many countries have. In natural gas, they also have over 1 billion cubic meters of natural gas. They have manganese, they have oils, they have granite, all different kinds of building materials. The list is unbelievably long. Nickel, titanium, manganese, name it. It's there. Copper alone, they have 25 million tons, and uranium, 45,000 tons. So we wonder, really, because this is not being discussed. So is it really this resource that they want to stick their fingers into the cookie jar, so to speak? So I would like to think that, to believe the line of the United States, that Russia is moving. Russia has put in so much of their armed forces and military resources in the area. Somehow, the back of my mind, I'm still thinking where the Russian troops are is actually their place, their country. They're not actually on top of anyone else. By the same token, the United States cannot say so because other countries around the NATO countries have their own forces elsewhere in the area. So sometimes you really wonder. I recall, if not, it's not too late, that there had been an agreement after the Berlin Wall had been torn down, had been torn down, that they're not supposed to move an inch to the east, that they stay where they are and everybody stays as is. I seem to remember that because during that time we were doing a lot of traveling in that area. Yet we know that places like Romania, Poland, Lithuania, the Baltic states, etc., have already joined NATO. Now, this is probably what they would call the last frontier. This is actually the divide between Europe and Russia. So, as I said earlier, I would be more apprehensive and more fearful of the consequences on us. Right now, we're seeing a 9-year high in fuel prices. And we know we're 100% dependent on imported fuel. There's now a move to lower the taxes on fuel, which will mean depriving the government of resources to be able to continue operating. But more than that, the people, I think, the people are not really aware of the impact of something like this. And it cannot be viewed simply on the basis of a stock market drop in the value of the stock market. It cannot be that. I think we should put a human face on all these consequences. Now they're talking of sanctions to remove Russia from the SWIFT currency setup, sanctions for trade, etc., etc. And how is that going to impact on the world? Ukraine, Russia, they're one of the biggest exporters of wheat. Now, there's an price hike for flour. When flour goes up, food prices go up. So this is just how I want to see this, because I think that Mr. Laurel and Mr. Professor Anna and Dr. Ado will be able to give you more historical and more geopolitical points in this. But I would like to look at it really from the point of view of the man on the street.
Thank you very much, former Senator Nikki Cosseteng, for very comprehensive opening statement, very thought-provoking. Thank you very much. We'll ask questions later on. Next, we'd like to invite Professor Ana Malindog-Uy for her opening statement. Miss Ana?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. Yes.
Professor.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clear.
Thank you. Thank you, Wilson. Good morning to all, and thank you for attending this online public forum on the Ukraine crisis, analysis and lesson, and what lessons can we draw from this for Asia and the Philippines. The current military standoff in Ukraine somewhat mirrors one of the most frightening and nerve-wracking episodes of Cold War, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis, where leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union was engaged in a tense and stressful 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of a nuclear-armed Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles away from the U.S. shores. The U.S. then was prepared to use military force if necessary to neutralize the said perceived threat to its national security, in the same manner that Russia now is somewhat prepared to use military force as its last resort and accordingly as an act of self-defense to neutralize the perceived threat to its national security. For Russia, Ukraine joining NATO with the possibility of a missile system, military bases, and strike weapon system installation on a bilateral basis with Ukraine is an existential threat for Russia. If one is aware of the particulars and complexities of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a geopolitical tension during that era caused by the Soviet Union's reaction to the deployment and installation of missiles in Turkey by the United States. Hence, in the same manner that the world is now very much worried about the unpredictability and volatile situation in Ukraine, which could spark another world war if the West and Russia will not be able to strike a compromise, many people across the world, even us Filipinos, just like in the time of Cuban Missile Crisis, are troubled and apprehensive on the possibility that the world is on the brink of a nuclear war. This is not a conventional warfare only, no, if in any case a war breaks out. Obviously, NATO's expansionism seems to be the cause of the current military impasse over Ukraine between Russia and the West. Russia sees NATO's expansionism towards its borders, particularly the prospect of Ukraine's being a member of NATO, as alarming and threatening to its national security. On the other hand, it is evident that the Russians have legitimate security concerns that the West must come to terms with and respect if the world is to avoid another world war. To ensure its national security, Russia they claim and they demand an assurance from the West that Ukraine would never be part of NATO, for US forces to withdraw its forces in Eastern European countries that are already part of NATO, and to implement the 2015 ceasefire agreement in Ukraine. Instead of dismissing the legitimate security demands of Russia and threatening Russia, and actually it's not only threatening, I think they're imposing already sanctions as coercive measures, diplomatic efforts should be pursued further to de-escalate tension to resolve the military standoff in Ukraine. Also, sensationalizing the Ukraine crisis and hyping up the rhetoric of a Russian invasion will not help stabilize the situation in Ukraine. All parties should resolve their differences through dialogues, negotiation, and explore all diplomatic channels at their disposal to de-escalate tension. The world cannot afford another world war, much more the possibility of a nuclear war. What are the lessons we can draw, especially for the Philippines? If one will closely observe the situation in the ongoing tug-of-war between the US and Russia over Ukraine, without discounting the role of NATO, but taking into consideration that NATO, more often than not, follows the lead of the US, then Ukraine is a pawn in the geopolitical maneuvers of the US because of its strategic geographical location, in the same manner that the Philippines will most likely be a pawn of the US in its rivalry with China for supremacy, dominance in the Indo-Pacific region. Thus, our national, political, and military leaders must be more discerning, prudent, and careful in how they position the country amidst geopolitical tension and reality surrounding the region and even beyond it. The Philippines should avoid following the footsteps and avoid the fate of Ukraine. The country should refuse and prevent at all costs the possibility of being a proxy or a pawn of any superpower in their proxy wars. The Philippines must avoid being used as a pawn by any superpower to encircle another superpower. We should avoid being in the front line of any military confrontation and competition consequential to the power struggle of superpowers, which in the first place is not our own making, and it's not for our and it's not to our advantage, and that's not the country's core national interest. On the other hand, amid the volatile and ever-changing geopolitical realities worldwide, particularly in our region, ASEAN must remain a region of peace, progress, and stability, and it should remain a nuclear-free zone. Likewise, and most importantly, ASEAN member states must be consistent and steadfast in upholding ASEAN centrality. meaning ASEAN's role in the regional security architecture, regional order, and power dynamics between and among external powers that have interest in the region. No doubt, the world is once again haunted and troubled by a threat of a bloody West-East military confrontation and conflagration, which is threatening not only the promotion and proliferation of world peace, security, and prosperity, but the very survival of humankind. This issue is not only an issue about military. This is also economic, as what former Senator Nikki Kusuting have said. No, when there's a war, of course, the first thing is oil price. Definitely, the oil price would shoot up, and then everyone is affected. Once again, I think we live in interesting times, and I hope that world leaders will have a genuine interest of humanity in their hearts when the time of reckoning finally arrives. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant morning to all. And yes, I also sent my statement to Mr. Wilson to be, if the media people are interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Ana Malindog Uy. Next, we'd like to invite very thought-provoking all your analysis. I couldn't wait to ask questions from the media. And last but not the least, former Philippine diplomat in Washington, D.C. and radio host, analyst, Adop Aglinawan for his opening statement.
Morning to all. Good morning, Wilson. I have provided the chat box with a link to my paper, and those of you who want to print it can do so. The problem of Russia in this situation is that there is no present détente or equalization of forces in the area of engagement. NATO is very much stronger than whatever Russia could offer by the mere number of its members surrounding Russia. But it is said that the best weapon in the art of war is the element of surprise. I was not surprised at all, however, when Russian President Vladimir Putin decided to recognize the independence of the two separatist regions in eastern Ukraine and plant peacekeeping boots on the ground there. Of course, this has drawn the condemnation in the US, especially, and some of its Western allies, NATO too, but I was terribly surprised at the reaction of the United Nations. NATO, the NATO chief calling it a violation of international agreements. But what agreement in customary international law can be paramount to the people of Luhansk and Donetsk, exercising their inherent right to self-determination? The test of sovereignty here by these two former regions of Ukraine can easily be proven and cast in stone, first through a plebiscite, and second, because with the help of Russia, they can enforce their will over the territory. This conflict will not, however, end here. I have mentioned in many discussions since 2014, when the Orange Revolution came about, funded profusely by US NGOs, one of which was Umidyar Network, that the template which Crimea did, bolting out as an autonomous region of Ukraine, proclaiming itself as an independent state and joining the Russian Federation, would not stop the animosity especially with the CIA and the MI6 operatives intervening. The agreements at Minsk I and Minsk II have somewhat postponed eventualities. This issue will nag for another decade or so. So Putin must be proactive because nobody can trust NATO, and more so, nobody can trust the United States, its puppeteer. The UN is a better fit here than NATO. But US and NATO have already broken their 1991 word to Mikhail Gorbachev prior to the disintegration of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that they will not recruit former members of the Warsaw Pact of 1995 signatories. Now, Ukraine is being recruited by NATO to improve its encirclement of Russia. As I have said earlier, it was best to teach Ukraine a permanent lesson. Putin should encourage Luhansk and Donetsk to perform their act of self-determination after the 24 so-called Orange Revolution, patterned after the Philippines EDSA, complete with American infiltration, funding, and false promises, but sans the violence. If Ukraine does not yet behave, then Donetsk should infect secessionism further to Zaporizhia and Kherson to eventually completely deny Ukraine of access to the Sea of Azov in the east, where Ukraine had occasionally challenged the Russian Navy based in Crimea. Ukraine will still have access to the Black Sea and would no longer pose any over-the-shoulder danger to Russia and the non-Russian regions surrounding the Sea of Azov, as the secessionist regions on the west and Russia on the east take full control of that sea. Most of Luhansk and Donetsk are urban industrialized area, and I appreciate the dissertation on the economic resources by the former senator on this particular aspect. With Russia as grandfather, they can sustain their economies. Zaporizhia is another urban area. That would leave Ukraine with only 2 urban areas inland adjacent to Luhansk and Donetsk, which is Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv, the later being also along the border of Russia and very much vulnerable. NATO cannot expect these 4 Ukrainian regions, Luhansk, Donetsk, plus Kharkiv on the north and Zaporizhia on the south, to be sympathetic to them. They're mostly Russian or Russo ethnic and beneficiaries of Russian industrialization and heavy investments when the USSR was still in existence. To end, I say again, it would be foolish to trust the forked tongue and the twisted mind of the Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Addo Pagdinaon, for the opening statement, and to all 5 people. Very thought-provoking, very enlightened analysis of the Ukraine crisis. Before we go to the media questions, I'd like to say na all 5 of you reflected the views of even Western analysts, even American analysts. Yesterday, New York Times columnist, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, Thomas Friedman. Ang column niya, this is an American very prominent columnist. His column yesterday, he said, "This is Putin's war, but America and NATO aren't innocent bystanders." Imagine, this is a famous American. And Time Magazine columnist Ian Bremer also said, wooing Ukraine to NATO was a strategic error by the US. And also last night, somebody from San Francisco, an intellectual, sent me a video which we should all watch. It's entitled Ukraine on Fire. Ukraine on Fire. It's by Oliver Stone. Everybody should watch this. So thank you very much for your analysis. And every one of you have fantastic points. And what struck me naman, Senator Nikki mentioned wheat. Ukraine is a major exporter of wheat, and it might affect pandesal prices. I hope not. Talaga. That's the first thing I was so concerned.
Wilson,
Very perceptive.
if you look at your purchasing, the
Yes,
price
nagko-complain na nga. They're here listening in the office.
is going to increase by 30 to 50% or even more.
They're shocked na nga. They're saying our
Yeah.
pandesal prices are no longer realistic now. Sabi
That's
nila. Yes.
yeah.
So I'd like to summarize a little bit lang. Mr. Laurel said a while ago, many good points. Sabi niya, Philippines should not be the Ukraine of Asia. We should prevent this situation. Senator Nikki mentioned all these interesting points. And you have a catchy phrase that I could not also forget, balance of terror, because they keep saying balance of power. But for many people in the world, it's like a balance of terror with all these thousands of military installations and presence worldwide. And then Professor Anna Malindog-Uy mentioned, very interesting also, that we should not, sabi niya, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it struck me also, like, because Cuba is near Florida and all that, and we in the Philippines near Xiamen, Guangzhou, and all that areas. And of course, Doc Paglinawan said the West broke its promise to Gorbachev about not wooing Warsaw Pact countries to NATO, and used the word puppeteer and puppet. So it's dangerous to be a puppet. Sabi nga ni Ms. Anna Malindog, to be a pawn. We should not be a pawn of anyone. A question from one media friend here is saying, is the situation in Ukraine, the dangerous situation now, is that similar to our BFA and EDCA? Because somebody messaged me now that some European countries like Poland, Romania, or something, they also have their BFA situation, similar treaties now. Are you concerned that these strategic tie-ups now might endanger Philippine security? Like, example, North Korea now. North Korea now has missiles. So unlike noon, Vietnam War, the Americans used Clark Air Base to bomb the Vietnamese and Laos and all that, but they could not bomb us back. They don't have the missiles before North Vietnam. What about now? Can the four of you comment on this question? The danger to Philippine peace about all these BFA and EDCA daw? Can anyone comment? Is it a valid concern? Sabi ni Nery Colmenares when he was young daw, he was concerned because Vietnam was being bombed, but the Vietnamese are not our enemies, but Clark Air Base was being used to bomb them daw. And then he was concerned. And now, North Korea has nuclear warhead, missiles. And what if the US have a war with North? Is this a valid concern?
Okay, let me start,
Yes.
no?
Yes.
Good morning again.
For
And thank
experts,
you.
yes.
Okay, let me start. Good morning again, and thank you for that question. For me,
Yes.
no, I would
Yes.
say yes, it's a valid concern. What you can see, if you look at Poland and Romania, they have
Yes.
there are military bases in there. That's not Polish, no. It means like
Yes.
foreign military bases in those countries because they're part of NATO and also U.S. forces are there. So that's a concern as well for Ukraine, for Russia, in the very first place. Now, how it applies in the country. For me, as I've said in almost all of my interviews with regards to issues that has something to do with geopolitics, as much as possible, these treaties that we have or agreements that we have with the United States, we have to revisit. The next administration, I think, has to revisit them, like the EDCA, the Visiting Forces Agreement, and even the MDT. We need to revisit and check if it's really necessary for us to have that. As much as possible, if we pursue an independent foreign policy, I don't think we need those things, because as much as possible, we need to have a neutral stand on all of this, no? And one thing that we need to remember, kapag may military bases ang isang country, especially foreign military bases, ng isang superpower, ang ano yan ang tawag ko dyan is magnet for conflict. Okay? Kapag nagkagulo, ang unang titirahin dyan is tayo, kasi nandito naman ang kanilang military bases. Especially if the war or the outbreak of a war hindi naman nandun sa paligid or sa kung saan man naroon ng isang superpower, kundi dito sa halimbawa sa region natin. So uunahin tayo. So that's not good for us. And wala, di ba? Tinanggal na nga dapat yung military bases na yan before in 1990s. Pero bumalik dahil sa EDCA, dahil sa ayun nga, pag-hype up ng tinatawag mong China bullying and all that. But actually, there's no such thing. Kasi the Philippines, wala naman tayong kaaway China is not our enemy. It's our friend. Actually, tinutulungan tayo economically. So why do you have this military bases in the country in the first place? Yeah. Tapos, for me, so ang stand ko dyan is review, take a look at these agreements, kung talabang kailangan ba dito yan. Ang mga agreements ba yan, when it comes to provisions, it's balanced and to our advantage, not necessarily to disadvantage natin. Lagi tayong dapat, ang ina-uphold natin, ang national core interest ng Pilipinas. And one of that is for the Philippines not to be in any war na hindi naman natin gusto at wala tayong alam at wala tayong pakialam. Yun yung ko dyan, point ko dyan.
Follow up lang, before the others answer. Anna, you mentioned a while ago, ASEAN should be a nuclear-free zone. So yes. That is also part of that, diba?
Yes.
The whole ASEAN.
Yes, the whole ASEAN region should be a zone of peace and a nuclear-free zone. ASEAN centrality must be asserted. Ibig sabihin, sa lahat ng nangyayari na geopolitical na mga maneuverings sa mga superpowers sa loob ng sa region natin, ang ASEAN should be in the center and it should have leverage na hindi tayo magagamit ang buong ASEAN sa lahat ng mga geopolitical na mga maneuverings that would lead to a compromising situation, kasi that is not good for us. That is not good for our prosperity and development as countries in the developing world. Take note.
Thank you.
Paano pa lang tayo, pasulong pa lang tayo out of pandemic, tapos kakaproblema na naman. So I don't think that's good for us.
Thank you. Somebody wanted to add.
Yeah. I just wanted to add again. Let's learn from history. Second World War, imperialist wars ng Japan and America. Merong isang kandidato nagpasalamat na tumulong sa atin daw ang Estados Unidos sa Second World War. Actually, ang Estados Unidos ang dapat magpasalamat dahil the Philippines was the cause of the delay of Japan's offensive all the way down to Australia, number one. Number two, tayo ay one of the most devastated countries in Asia. Ang city of Manila was not even spared by the Americans when the Japanese were already on the run. Dinurog pa ang Manila. I think this is very important to correct in the minds of many people. The lesson of our history is that the getting involved with the wars of the U.S. And other imperialist powers is a detriment to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Laudel, for that answer. The two other panelists, would you like to comment about our all these agreements being? Former Senator Nikki Cosseteng.
Yeah, I think we have to disabuse our minds. The U.S. today is not the same as the U.S. 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Number one. Second, 40 years ago, there were no other so-called powers except the United States. And, maybe they could push their weight around that time.
Yes.
But if you look at the damage that they had done and what we had gained from them in the last half a century, I don't think it's commensurate to the kind of damage that we had suffered during the war. That's one thing. Secondly, we still have a lot of strings attached to the United States to our detriment, whether in agriculture, etc. For example, if you just, earlier I mentioned wheat. If you just look at what U.S. wheat, has done to the Philippines, that is already one of the reasons why your pandesal costs so much, and maybe a bigger percentage of our population can no longer afford to eat pandesal. And things are still
Oo
going.
nga.
But
Very,
seriously,
very.
U.S. wheat was very active. When I was around that time, they were very active in trying to kill any and all others who were looking for other sources of flour, so that pandesal and food prices, noodles, etc., biscuits, etc., would go down. But of course, there was that, talagang, there were really those claws of the eagle, if you want to call it. So it's not like you're benefiting from this arrangement, but rather, of course, they dump on us all this used military wear, obsolete military wear, a hardware, etc. And what? And we owe them a favor? Really, seriously, as mentioned earlier by Professor Anna, sila may utang na loob sa atin.
Mhm.
Wala tayo. Hindi sila isang hakbang na lang sa Vietnam, etc. And by the way, to me, that war in Vietnam has not ended. The suffering of
Wow.
those people continue to
Yes.
this day. The victims of Agent Orange and all those chemical warfare that they had used there are still being suffered today by the Vietnamese. And there's really no I'm sorry, to talk about, to this day. I think a good 5 million, 6 million Vietnamese have lost their lives, had lost their lives. And if this is going to happen in Eastern Europe, this is not like it's an archipelago, like it's an island. No, it's just sometimes one road that will divide these different countries. So you can just imagine how much more suffering this is going to cause. And as earlier mentioned, Donetsk and Luhansk are just about legitimately recognized. So this is not supposed to be an act of aggression. This is really just calling a spade a spade. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Senator Nikki Cosseteng, for your thought-provoking ideas and analysis. Adoba would like to add, or yes,
I would like to
Mr.
add
Ado
something.
Pagdinawan. Thank you.
Yeah. To be very straight about it, we can always abrogate the visiting force agreement anytime. And the enhanced defense cooperation agreement is only up to 2024. So this will be in the hands of the incoming administration. But these are not treaties. These are mere executive agreements. What we must review, and I was hoping a review of this would start under the present administration. I don't know if it did. Was the Mutual Defense Treaty. The Mutual Defense Treaty was one of the 3 treaties that the Philippines entered with the United States because we were a fledgling country at that point, post-World War II, on the brink of collapse and facing a tremendous rehabilitation because, as you said, we were second only to Warsaw in terms of destruction. So we had the Mutual Defense Treaty. We also had the we also have the Military Bases Agreement, the MDT, therefore, and the MBA. We also had, because people are using the Visiting Forces Agreement and MCA as a justification to still maintain the umbilical cord to the modernization in terms of equipment and military supplies. But we had a third treaty. We had a third treaty. This was the Mutual Defense Pact, or more particularly, its subsidiary, the Military Assistance Package, the MAP. And so, really, I don't see any reason why there has to be a mutual defense treaty. The mutual defense treaty was formulated, as the late Ambassador Albert Encomienda would said, as a preparatory step towards the establishment of a SEATO, a Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. But when that did not materialize, all the provisions of the Mutual Defense Treaty are now obsolete, must be subject to review. But we have to be very careful about it because we have to land into another treaty that would economically still preserve our relationship with the United States, as well as any country who would like to help us, and provided it suits our national interest. Because our currency is still attached to the dollar. And technologically, many equipment, especially in the military, still follow the American doctrine. In the presidential debate, for instance, that I witnessed with the SMNI, there was a fallacy there saying that the abolition of the armed forces of the Philippines, and nobody corrected it. It was supposed to have been the abolition of the Philippine Army only. You cannot abolish the armed forces of the Philippines. So I would just like to refer to that because, and their equipment, the military equipment, is very much, and their training, very much within the American doctrine. So those things will have to be reviewed, and the whole treaty should be updated. As the senator said, it is obsolete. The America now is not the America 30 years ago. And
Yes.
definitely not, because the US now, the State Department and the White House are using terms like Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, which means, ladies and gentlemen, that they have already accepted the reality of a tripolar superpower structure. All right? The United States, America, the Euro-Atlantic power, which is Russia, and the Indo-Pacific power, which is China. So the pertinence, besides its vagueness and tardiness in case of an attack, as the former President Marcos had said in a press conference, the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. in 1982. What good is this that when attacked, you will be discussing what to do, what next to do with the Philippines here in the Capitol Hill, in the Congress of the United States, while we are already dying over there. So that's it, Professor.
Thank you very much, Ado, and Senator Nikki, Anna, and Mentong for your analysis. There's a question. Yes,
Wilton,
Mr. Laurel.
yeah.
Yes.
If there's a question, let's go ahead with the question first.
Yes, there's a question here related to what you just said. Mr. Ado mentioned a while ago about the SMNI presidential debate. Senator Nikki mentioned that the US of 40 years ago, 50 years ago, was the only superpower, now no longer the same situation. Related to the debate, the word non-aligned was used in the debate discussed by Carita Carlos and the presidential candidate. Do you think that 1960s term non-aligned could apply to the Philippines, ASEAN, and even Ukraine? Can we promote a non-aligned stance towards these superpowers and their rivalries? Can we push this idea na we are friends with all of them, but their quarrels are their own quarrels. Don't tie us up militarily to one superpower. Is this possible? The non-aligned idea of the 1960s, di ba I think it was Sukarno, Nehru, and all these leaders. I know Carlos P. Romulo attended also the Bandung Summit and all that. That was before I was born, actually. Do you remember the non-aligned movement? Is it still possible for the Philippines and even Ukraine to do that, to end wars?
The non-aligned movement, the term non-aligned came from Mao Zedong
Yes.
as the Third World, and the Bandung Conference was 1995. The major countries there were, of course, Indonesia, India, China, and some countries in Africa, all the way in Africa. I think the term is now not
Not in
being
use.
used. It's just that the plain sovereign and independent nations.
Yes.
Well, it can be a new battle cry for the third world countries, but
Yes.
apparently this is not a reason, because I think the situation calls for an alignment with the vision for the world, not for countries. And that is why it has been mentioned also that the multipolar world, the tripolar world, but essentially the concept of the multipolar world and the unipolar world. That is the major contradiction in the world today. And so it's for the Philippines to decide and clarify in their minds which vision they would seek. I think there is a lack of clarity here. We have to define the challenge of the times that the Filipino as a nation and as a republic should answer to. And of course, my recommendation is that we pursue the multipolar world, because it is a safer world, a better managed world, and a peaceful world.
Thank you. Multipolar world. Thank you very much, Senator Nikki Cosseteng. Yes.
Yes, I think this is possible. What
Yes.
is political will? We just have to think for ourselves and define what our national interest really is.
Yes.
Because for this time, our national interest has always been like hitched on to Washington.
Yes.
So unless we define national interest in our terms, it is going to be very difficult to be, quote, non-aligned. There's also, I think now, more than at any time in world history, there's always, now I think it's the best time to assess. Because the United States pedals itself as the defender of freedom and democracy. The United States, struts around like it's the police of the world. Like they only they have the solution. They have the answers. They have the means. They have the way. Obviously, it's not like that. Because if you look at American society today, I wouldn't want the Philippines to look like that. I wouldn't want the Philippines to be a country of former middle class, or strong middle country where the middle class used to be very strong, to be now a country of homeless people, smack in the streets of the big cities. Garbage is not collected. People are hungry. People are in food lines. I mean, this is not the United States that we know of. So if this is what they're still peddling, democracy, freedom, etc., and that's what the consequence is of their kind of democracy and freedom, I don't want us to be like that. Seriously. That's one. Second, another thing is, it was my attention was called by one of the persons who came into the chat box and talked about how the United States has actually looked at our veterans. There's going to be just a dozen left after all. But how do they treat us? I remember before we line up in the U.S. Embassy since like 1 o'clock in the morning to be able to line up to get a number for to apply for a visa. Yeah, I mean, is this the way that you treat an ally? I mean, if this is the way you treat your allies, you can imagine how you treat your enemies. So this is not something very healthy, I think.
Thank you, Senator, for all those very valid and thought-provoking questions for us to reassess Miss Anna, Professor Anna
Yes,
Malindopuy.
Yes, I think it's very possible, and it's actually happening already. But I call it equidistance among between superpowers ang positioning natin, and it's already happening. It's not only actually the Philippines is doing it right now under President Duterte. No, we're trying the president has been trying a lot to have an equidistance between, like, for example, China, Russia, and because these are the superpowers, and China and the US, trying to say that we can deal with all of you in an equal terms, and you recognize us as a sovereign state. You don't control us. We deal with you based on different issues and basis. We have interest, and also we have good relation with each other. We're friends, but you don't control us. You don't dictate our policies. And I think the president has been doing that already. It's not easy because that's a balancing act, but it's there, no? And I think the next administration, the challenge of the next administration is how to pursue that, but rather improve it more, no? By again reviewing our agreements with the US, like the BFA, EDCA, and even the MPT. On another note, it's not only the Philippines doing it, ASEAN member states as well. Look at Singapore. Singapore has that kind of policy as well, no? Equidistance. Malaysia is the same. Thailand, Indonesia is the same. They're trying to relate with superpowers based on their national interests. And I think we should do that. At the end of the day, the responsibility of our national leaders is always protecting the national interests of the country and what's best for us, and siding with one superpower with a very volatile geopolitical situation that is happening in the world right now and in our region, and the geopolitical realities that we have. I don't think that's not the way forward, no? I think pursuing an independent foreign policy, trying to make it sure that you have a very good equidistant relations with all the superpowers and even other powers at all, is the best way forward for our country and even for the region, no? Yeah, that's my position, no?
Thank you. Somebody texted a question here. What if now Taiwan becomes a Ukraine issue? Will with the bases in the Philippines be in play? Would that be would that be a danger to our situation? Because somebody texted here, Taiwan is just like, I don't know how far from Luzon. We are next door to Taiwan, and Taiwan is a hot button issue for China historically, and it's a non-negotiable issue. But the US politicians seem to be drumming up noises about Taiwan issue. Is that a valid concern? Can we ask our politicians about it? Can you comment?
Sige, si Adaw muna.
Is it a danger to us? The
Well,
BFA
I will comment on that at the end of my statement.
Yes.
Actually, this kind of alignment thing, or alignment for the purpose, as
Yes.
in military and security alliances, is laos na, obsolete na yan, and anachronistic. What we're seeing now in the case of a superpower is another kind of coming together, as in China's Belt and Road Initiative, not to kill each other, but to help each other live in a very difficult world such as now. And this is what I see. If this were economic alliances or alignments, I think it would be beneficial to everybody. These military security arrangements are impossible. Perhaps we can do it with many countries, but this will be impossible with the US. The US has invented words such as rule-based, which is not based on any constitution or law, but based on my American exceptionalism that we are supposed to be the superpower, because they have also invented the word reciprocity. Scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And if we can do that and agree on that, then we sign a treaty, we sign an agreement. So it's impossible. The tit for tat is an American phenomenon. I would rather have the Belt and Road Initiative, where we can, and things like RCEF, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Taiwan.
Yes.
But there is a difference in premises here, because Taiwan is actually China.
Mm.
Nobody else can dispel that. In fact, China has been very patient with Taiwan. Taiwan would most likely, if China were to be given the preeminence, end up like an SAR, a special autonomous region, like Macau, like Hong Kong.
Hmm.
But if these Taiwanese people go for secession, it would only take maybe 2 hours for everything to solve itself. How China will do that, I will leave that to China. But I doubt very well if China will be as patient as Vladimir Putin, or in the case of Ukraine. Actually, Putin waited for 8 years to something that he could have already done in 2014 together with Crimea. That's what I was saying. Luhansk and Donetsk would have already been declaring their self-determination. But Vladimir Putin is a different person altogether. We do not want to be associated with a power that spends 57% of its disposable income for war. That is the United States. That's why Biden is having a problem now, because he is the one that's balancing power between the war economy and the real economy that he must address. That is why I don't want to live there. I could hardly find a job there. When I came home, on the second day I was here, I was already working. So, guys, face up with these realities.
Okay.
It's a tripolar world right now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Wilson,
Thank you very much.
Wilson, on the matter of Taiwan, let me contribute.
Yes, Mr.
thoughts,
Laurel.
no?
Yes.
Number one, Taiwan will not break away from China. 40% of Taiwan's economy today depends on China. 40%.
Yes.
Number two, it is a good candidate for the Ukraine of Asia, because it has a puppet government currently under the Americans. But even the Americans don't want to lose Taiwan, because they definitely will lose Taiwan if China is provoked to take over with a simple declaration of Taiwan independence. That's the only red line for China. China will not physically, militarily need to take over China, because over time, Taiwan will naturally be absorbed into the motherland. So that is now the U.S. Dumps hundreds of millions of arms every year to Taiwan. Of course, naturally, every year China also protests. This is like an SOP already. Every year it goes on. So, but it is a good candidate for the Ukraine of Asia, because the Americans can really use selfish elements inside the DPP, Democratic People's Party, to provoke, push for a declaration of independence. And in 24 hours, mainland China will take over Taiwan in such a scenario. And the Taiwanese know that. So definitely the Philippines will be used. The Americans have been trying to draw the Japanese to make statements that they will get involved if Taiwan is attacked by the mainland in case of a declaration of independence. But I don't think it's going to happen, because even the Taiwanese themselves will not want that to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Laurel. Anna or Senator?
Uh, yeah, a very
Yeah.
quick answer to the question. No?
Yes.
Yes, Taiwan is actually another possible flashpoint of a military confrontation between, let us say, no, the U.S. and China. But I think that will not happen in the near period, in the near future. No, why? Because I think China is very patient. I think China will rather go the way for reconciliation rather than invasion that is being, hyped out by Western media at these days. Na, China will invade Taiwan. No, I think it's just a propaganda against China. But for me, the way I see it, China will be patient and it will push through a more reconciliatory relation with Taiwan until the time that the people of Taiwan would because it's really a part of China. It's in the Constitution of Taiwan. You can see it there that it is a province of China. At the same time, in the Constitution of China, it's also there. It's stated there that it is a province of China. So it's there. It's been recognized. I think the only provoking move there is if in any case the puppet government in Taiwan will declare independence. And that's another thing. No, that's a provocation. But even then, I think the Chinese will be very careful in all this and be very prudent because they are very prudent people. I've been there, no, in China. They're not the kind of people who just act like that. No, I don't think so. I think they would be more patient, but of course, we don't want any conflagration in Asia as much as possible. And the Philippines also must be very careful in how we deal with these issues. And I think our leaders must be prudent also in trying to position ourselves in there. And we must respect the one China policy. No, and we must not follow Lithuania. No, what happened to Lithuania? That's a
Yes.
very crazy thing, no? Yeah, so that's my position.
Miss Anna, a follow-up lang to what you just said. The BFA and EDCA, can we publicly tell the world and the US that if you get involved in Taiwan and other issues, we should not be involved? Pwede bang ganyan? Or are we tied down to them with these treaties?
Well,
Anna and to others. Can
for
we
me,
publicly, Philippines, say we are not part of that?
these are treaties, no, that actually we're part of at the moment. Again, we are a sovereign state. We can always make decision that we think is to our advantage and that we will not
Yes.
be put in a compromising situation. As a sovereign state, our government has the power, our president has the power to review these agreements and possibly say no if it's if we really have to say no. No.
Yes.
As a sovereign state, we have to exercise our sovereign right to determine what's the best course of action for this country, not to be dictated by any superpower at all. Because in the very first place, it's us Filipinos who will suffer if the decisions are not good or we have mistakes in making decisions about these things. So I think that's something that we have to always remember, that we are a sovereign state. Therefore, we have the power to determine what is the best course of action for us, economically, militarily, politically speaking, even in international relations. We have to uphold our national interest.
I just
Yes.
like to contribute a side comment to
Yes, yes.
what I fully agree with the statements from Maestra Ana Malindaguy. My side comment is the only problem is, of course, we're sovereign, we're independent, and President Duterte has been expressing that and implementing that, but we have Amchurian candidates and
Yeah.
Amchurian officials, like the one who says that the US should be in the code of conduct discussion. That
That's
is
another issue.
absolutely ridiculous. You have a stranger from 12,000 miles away invited to talk about the issues among our community here in Asia. That's why,
That was in the SMNI debate. I remember
Yes,
that. I was
yes.
shocked.
yeah.
Yes.
So let us be wary of the Amchurian candidates and officials.
Yes. Yes.
I'm
Senator,
Surian.
It's not running
Senator
for
Nikki, I
office.
remember you made a movie with former President Estrada before to help assert Philippine independence. And so I think what your advocacy before is now more relevant with all these dangers of superpower rivalries.
Yeah,
Yes.
All the
we
more.
wrote
So I'd like
with Ricky Lee, we wrote a script for Dragnet, the movie of Erap and Ching Tong
Yes.
Chai at that time, to promote
Ah.
Philippine-China and Chinoy relations and cooperation.
Wow,
unity and
I
solidarity.
should ask you about that.
That was a long time ago.
Mentong,
I
can I
had an
interject?
auntie who had a part role there daw. I had an auntie daw.
Yeah.
I heard. So, Senator and to the others, so
Yeah.
we have to assert talaga independent foreign policy more
Um,
now, no?
Just as
And
a
not
just
be the Ukraine of Asia. Tama?
um
Yes, Senator Nikki
yeah,
Cosseteng. Yes.
just as an aside, no. Yes. Ricky Lee wrote the script of Sakuko ng Agila. And I
Wow.
and
Siya
I
pala
tell
yun?
and I tell you, I think 70% of that script was stricken off.
Ah,
Yes.
70% of the script. So it was
What-
diluted.
But when I went to the premiere of the movie
Yes.
I was in, and we
Yes.
shot every single second of that movie together,
Yes.
It- already a different movie.
70% diluted.
I
Wow.
Because a lot of the important dialogue, the facts, the figures,
Wow.
etc., washed out from that movie.
Wow.
And yet, of course, it's an anti-American movie, no? But
Yes.
a lot of the essential dialogue were all removed. You can ask Ricky. I didn't recognize
Wow.
it, but anyway, like that.
Thank you
Now,
for reminding.
going back to the Taiwan
Yes,
issue,
Taiwan issue.
you cannot imagine the massive amounts of investment that Taiwan has in China.
Yes.
If the Chinese were a no good sort of people,
Yes.
that would have happened. Between
You're correct, huh?
the two of them, they know that it's not possible for one to just bomb the other,
Yes,
meaning
yes.
bombing the little island, you know.
Yes,
But-
yes.
But China cannot help it. There's somebody 12,000 miles away that's really stoking the flames of this.
Yes.
So that way, I mean, just think, 310 million Americans. Most of them cannot even tell the difference between the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans.
Yes.
And they can,
Mga-
can't even tell the difference. They even think they're just one people. So
yes,
how
yes.
people like this, who have very low cultural tolerance, who have very low appreciation of thousands of years of culture vis-a-vis their 200 plus years or whatever it is, So it's very difficult for people like this to think of policies that will be for the betterment of the world, which is what we want to see. We have overseas Filipinos in, 200
Yes.
countries in the world, seriously, every corner of the world. Anytime there is a blow up in any part of the world, there's always a Filipino family that will be affected, incomes that are not going to be earned, and opportunities for employment, for business, etc., that are just going to be killed. So anywhere in the world that this happens,
Thank you very much.
there's a Filipino
Galing.
lifeline.
Maganda what you just said, ha? I remember pa, all the iPhones are being made in China by a Taiwanese firm. Galing.
Billions of dollars are
Yes, that.
owned by
So,
Taiwan. So that means even the Taiwanese themselves trust China.
yes.
Why
Independent.
there? Why aren't you going to put your investment in the Philippines or somewhere else? Why are you there in
Yes.
China? There must be something in China where Apple is even there.
Yes.
What is Apple doing there? If China was a no good, place of discrimination, etc. So I
1
think
million employees working for Apple there. Yes.
there has to be as I said, a clarification of the definition of terms. Because the every country has the right to defend itself. If there are terrorists in a particular country, then they have to be able to handle it without somebody from outside calling it genocide. Because nobody is calling genocide what the Americans are doing to the black people, are doing to the minorities, are doing to the Hispanics and the Asians. Now, there was a woman who was pushed into the tracks of the subway.
Yes, from Cebu.
Sure.
Originally
And
from
that
Cebu.
woman was not from China. That woman's from the Philippines.
From Cebu daw, I heard.
Yes. In other words, this is a civilized country. This is a country where that's supposed to be promoting democracy and freedom, and they're pushing people, you know, into the subway tracks. Something's wrong there.
Thank you very much for all those thought-provoking ideas and questions for all of us. Now it's almost time up. Can we request our four very distinguished, very enlightened panelists and research speakers to give their closing statements to summarize your wonderful, interesting point. I thought I already knew a lot, but listening to the four of you is like crash course on geopolitics, history, and reality. Thank you for reminding all of us about the balanced view of the world. Let us begin maybe with Mr. Herman Laurel.
Yes.
For your open closing statement to summarize your point.
Okay. Yeah, I think in 60 seconds,
Yes.
I'd like to say that this is another opportunity for the Filipino thinking class to help the nation clarify its vision of the world. We are a global player now. President Duterte allowed us to be a global player by having an independent foreign policy. And so now is the time for the media also to help bring these options to our people, both in the vernacular, in Tagalog, and in the English print and social broadcast media. Ano ba ang gusto ng Pilipino? Yung unipolar world na isang bida lang ang Estados Unidos, o yung maraming mga nagsasalo-salo, nag-uusap, yung tawag na multipolar world. And what is it really in for us? In a multipolar world, we are equals to 174 members of the international community. Yun lang po.
Sorry to interrupt. There's another question, follow-up, sorry. From Mr. Tony Calao, baka I could insert short answers lang from everyone. Sabi ni Tony Calao, what is the likelihood that Ukraine will be divided like North and South Korea was divided to resolve this situation now? How do you foresee it?
Well, I think quick answer din. Of course,
Yes, quick answer.
Crimea has returned to Russia. Donetsk and Luhansk will go back to Russia. Putin has prepared this for the past 10 years. And before that, in 2014, he also prepared by paying all IMF debts in the year 2000. In 2019, he paid off all foreign debts of Russia. And now there is the US dollar reserves of Russia is only 16%. There is a tremendous percentage of gold in that reserve and Chinese yuan. He has a plethora of currency swaps and trading based on local currencies, so it's so many countries and China, of course. So this is going to be sealed in the next few months as the independent part of Ukraine, which will become independent republics. Yun lang po.
Thank you. That's a question from Mr. Tony Calao. Then we'll go now to the closing statement of Miss Senator Nikki Coseteng. For your, we learned a lot. Say you mentioned a lot of things today, from the worrying price of wheat. Tama kayo, Senator. Hindi ko makalimutan kasi nasa pandesal kami. Pandesal and cakes business. Diba the flag of Ukraine is blue and yellow? Blue symbolizes the sky. The yellow symbolizes the wheat of Ukraine, yung flag. Kaya thank you for reminding us that it will affect pandesal and everything. So we should all be concerned about this chaos there. Sorry. Senator Nikki Coseteng, your closing statement.
Well, thank you, Wilson, for the invitation. And I too learn every time I'm in your fora. I learn a lot because your guests are always very intelligent and very, they have relevant ideas, really, seriously.
Yes.
We are all students. I'd like to think that we are all students, not just of politics, but of life. And we have lived the last 50, 70 years in this world. seeing how things have shifted, and that we're still here, hopefully to see what the outcomes are going to be. We seek the end of poverty. We seek peace in the world. And somehow, these things are so elusive. And more than anything else, it's becoming clearer and clearer. The reason for why these peace and the eradication of poverty seems very elusive is really because there was really only just one power, or what they consider themselves as the one and only power, that determined what everyone else has to do and how things have to be done. I hope now, with the shifting of the tide, that things are going to be different, because we saw that in one country, which is China, they've been able to lift 700 million people out of poverty in less than half a. That's unprecedented worldwide. No other country has done that, and they have. Yeah. So that means there is hope. But I am bothered. Why? Because in the United States, when they talk about democracy, and they talk about freedom and liberty, etc., during this pandemic, maybe the top 10 wealthiest tripled,
Yes.
and the bottom 40% lost so much. So this to me is what I am not accepting as the model for the world to follow. And let them not insist on other people following them. And not anywhere you go. Afghanistan, you go to the Middle East, you go to, Syria, Lebanon, everywhere. The mess is there. And even here with us, So I hope that as students of politics and students of, world history, that we begin to see this at closer length, and that we begin to see this as really something that could affect us severely in the near future. We think it's a really long-winded discussion, but no, it's really just one click of a finger. We perish with it, or we develop and progress on our own in the direction that we choose to take. Those decisions are purely our own. We close the door and we can build our own priorities according to what we need. Because seeing their example is really already one sure shot message. We don't want to be like that.
Thank you very much.
Again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much to the very eloquent nationalist, former legislator, and now respected educator, Senator Nikki Cosseteng. By the way, she said she's not running, but she deserves to be in the Senate. She's not politicking and she doesn't want to run. Pero she is one person who I believe should be there. Pero ayaw niya eh. Maybe later on we should. Thank you, Senator Nikki Cosseteng, for all your words. What you just said about the billionaires in America getting richer during the pandemic is the non-stop advocacy of the complaint ni former Labor Secretary ni Clinton, si Robert Reich. Always tumalabas siya, sinasabi niya. You're very valid, all your points. Thank you. Next, we'd like to invite Miss Professor Ana Malindog-Uy for your closing statement to
Yes.
summarize your views and analysis.
Okay. Thank you, Wilson. Sorry. Like the game of chess, where pawns are usually used as either the first line of defense or the sacrificial lambs to protect a knight, a bishop, a rook, the queen, and the king, and pawns as pieces usually subject to the manipulation of other powerful pieces in the chessboard for survival, with the end goal of a winner takes all scenario. We as Filipinos should come together to ensure that the country will not be a pawn by the maneuvers of the superpowers. We should stand and uphold our national interests and stand for peace for our country and peace for the world. By the way, before I say thank you, there's a pahabol question here from
Yes.
Austin. Sabi niya, can you US did not include Ukraine in negotiation table in US-Russia, just like Pinoy and Albert Del Rosario betrayed Filipinos by having US negotiation with China on Scarborough without Philippine presence. This is from Austin Ong from EDC. So any comment from any of the panelists? That's his question. That
Yes.
I think he wants
Ukraine
one
is
of
not
us
part
to
of the.
comment on.
So it's similar to Afghanistan. The Trump
Yes.
negotiated with the rebels without informing their allies in Kabul
Yeah.
about it. Yes.
So that's
Your
the
comments?
pahabol
Your
question.
comments?
For me, my comment is, yun na nga sinasabi ko eh. That's the thing, no? These superpowers are, they have this, they have their maneuvers and all. Pero yung gitna mo, yung katulad ng Ukraine,
Hindi involved.
hindi nila sinasali sa usapan. Sila yung nag-uusap, yung nasa gitna, na siyang nagsasuffer, hindi nila sinasali. And I think
Di ba nangyari sa Treaty of Paris yan, 1898?
oh, well, it happens
Hindi tayo
almost in
nasali.
the history of the world. No? If you look at world history, no, katulad din yan dito sa Pilipinas, di ba? Yung mga demarcation ng mga borders, hindi sinasali yung dinidemarcate eh. Sila lang nag-uusap. I think my comment on that is we should not let it happen again this time around, no? We should always be strong and always remember. I think this is something that I think Filipinos should remember always. We are a sovereign state. And that means that we can make decision on our own. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that we have enemies already. No. It doesn't mean also that we're not friends anymore with the superpowers and other countries. No, of course not. We can always have that, we can use that sovereign rights to actually be in the center kapag ang negotiation, kapag ang pinag-uusapan na po ay ating bansa. And even not only that, ang ating region din. Kasi anumang nangyayari sa region would definitely affect the country. So yung comment ko dun kay Austin po. Salamat po.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ana Malindog-Uy. Last but not the least, former Philippine diplomat in Washington, D.C. and analyst, Mr. Ado Paglinawan, for your closing statement to summarize your views.
Response to the use of the United States of Philippines. If something happens in Taiwan, I find that our fastest way out of the Mutual Defense Treaty. Let's use that to get out of that treaty. There were some mentions about Arab and the year 1991, just as Gorbachev was doing his share in Europe. This was also when the foreign bases in the Philippines were outlawed. The Senate acted on it. That's why, by the widest stretch of my imagination, I cannot see any justification for EDCA, despite the twisted mind of the late B.S. Noynoy Aquino signing this agreement. Too many lawyers, too many legalisms that we are taught in the American definition of what can be and what cannot be. Let us define things, not in the rule-based, not using the American mindsets. Because we are not Americans. We are Asians. We are Filipinos. Ako ay Filipino. I joined Senator Nikki Cosette and therefore on the definition of our national interest. Not national interest based on national security, on the perception of a national security, but national security from the viewpoint of our national interest. We are a democracy of, by, and based on our national interest, and only by our national interest for the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ado Paglinawan. Senator, na-mention ni Ado about 1991, the Senate historic vote to end 500 years of foreign military presence in the Philippines. I remember the speech na basa ko, nakita ko sa video of the late Senate President Jovito Salonga. You were not senator yet ba at that time?
I was
You were
in the
not
House.
yet.
Representatives.
You were in the House of Representatives.
I ran in 1992, so I was elected to the Senate in 1992, the year after.
But you were witness to that on TV. You saw that on TV, the vote to end U.S. military presence in the Philippines. But I think I remember the retired legislator Salonga was disagreeing with the EDCA and the BFA and went to the Supreme Court to question it, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a very good point from all our resource speakers. This is a good time to review all these umbilical cords, matawag doon?
Yes.
Our umbilical cords that will impair our independent foreign policy and our non-aligned status. So thank you once again to our very enlightened analyst, Mr. Herman Laurel of Field Bricks Strategic Studies. Nag-tie up tayo ng Pandesal Forum with them. And also Professor Ana Malindog-Uy, also columnist siya ng Sovereign.ph and ASEAN Post. And also Mr. former Senator Nikki Coseteng, who should be in the Senate. We should convince her in the future to run again. She's more nationalistic and know a lot of things more than many of our legislators. And also Mr. Ado Paglinawan, a diplomat and activist and radio TV host, and also editor of Sovereign.ph and geopolitics and politics analyst. Thank you once again. Very good what you just said. I summarize it. Let us avoid becoming the Ukraine of Asia, diba? And let us help Ukraine get out of their mess. I hope kasi that will affect our pandesal in the Philippines. Walang biro, tama si Senator. Di ko maalis sa mind ko about the price of pandesal. Nagko-complain na sila about flour prices going up.
Not only
Well,
pandesal, think of the noodle. It's the poor people who are
Yes,
eating.
it's a noodle and the gasoline. We import all
Yes.
our oil.
all of that.
Wilson.
Yes.
Wilson, the economic consequences of what's going on right now in the eastern side of Europe is very
Yes.
something that we have to be alarmed kasi the moment a war breaks out and even the moment naglabas na ng sanctions ang
Yes.
US at saka yung Britain, no?
Gulo
So
yan
ibig
sa
sabihin,
economy.
ang nangyayari diyan ikakat nila ang Nord Stream 2. At saka
Yes.
yung Nord Stream 1, ang mangyari dyan, ang supply ng natural gas sa EU, sa European countries, maudlot. Tapos
Yes.
you take note, no, Germany is very dependent on the supply of natural gas sa Russia and even coal.
Yes.
Pag nangyari yan, syempre magkakaroon ka ng ang impact dyan kasi mag-shift to oil, mas more ang mga European states. Pag nagkataon, supply and demand yan eh. Pag
Tama.
bumaba
Sabi ni
ang
Senator,
supply, tumaas
9-year high.
Oo.
Sabi niya, 9-year high ang oil price. Sabi ni Ned.
Oo, mag-shoot up yan.
Wala
pag
pang
nag-shoot-
gera.
Wala pa. Oo, pag nag-shoot up yan, ang problema mo, kahit tayo malayo-layo ng konti dyan, apektado tayo kasi ang oil din natin dito sa, the international market, magkakaroon ng slow of supply, mas mababa ang
Yes.
supply kaysa sa demand, tataas ang presyo sa international market, apektado tayo, tapos tataas din ang mga bilihin natin kasi tataas ng presyo. Bakit?
Yes.
Kasi
yes, yes.
ang problema dito, ang oil companies natin, yung oil natin, hindi naman, ang energy natin ay controlled ng mga companies at hindi control ng state. So,
Yes.
nakakawak sa liig tayo.
Oh, that's
Di ba?
another issue. That's another major issue.
Kabit-kabit yan eh.
Ihabol ko lang ito
Mr. Lara.
dahil syempre maapektuhan tayo ng sitwasyon sa
Yes.
Ukraine and
Yes.
sa oil prices, international prices. But let's also try to focus on the Amchurian people here,
Yes.
trying to stop the Malampaya from
Yes.
becoming productive through their
Yes.
intervention. So marami po yan. Anyway, our time is
We
up.
should have a part 2, We should have a part 2.
Yes. At we should discuss the importance ng tinatawag mong joint exploration between China and the Philippines and other countries dyan sa gas exploration
Disputed areas.
no?
Yes, yes.
The state dapat ang dyan manguna pero hindi yan na-discuss given na may
That's very
issue
good
pa.
point. That's
that
very
should
good
be
point.
discussed. Oo.
Alam mo, you are not only 4 very good enlightened analysts, you are all nationalists also. I remember si Senator Nikki Cosseteng when she was senator, her advocacy sa economic policy is similar to what you are advocating against neoliberal and all that. That's another topic for us. Thank you very much to everyone. Yes,
Wilson,
ma'am.
yung sabi natin na 9-year high, no? We are doing $100 per barrel now. 100,
Can you imagine?
26 or $28, and it's now $100. 100.
By the way, even though mataas ang wheat and flour prices, don't forget that our media friends, we will send you pandesal and other baked goods na gift. Kahit na mahal ang pandesal, we will share our humble gift to our media friends. Please don't forget to message us your home addresses or visit us anytime to all the media guests who attended. All the more precious ang pandesal ngayon. Mataas ang
Also,
flour.
your pancit is very good.
I thank you, Senator. Yes, our cooks will be delighted and very happy.
Yes,
By the way,
yes.
our cooks, two of our cooks are from your mom's hometown. They're Ilonggos. Kaya we also have Ilonggo dishes. Ang galing nila.
I tried your chamiswa and
I thank you.
and bihon as well.
I
Shanghai.
thank you. Alam mo yun, sa miso took them 1 or 2 months to perfect because they never cooked that before. They didn't know what hamisa was before.
My friend asked me, how
Yes.
come they know how to do it? I said, because the owner is Chinese.
Yes, I keep telling them to do it. Nakakatawa. Thank you, Senator Nikki Cosseteng. By the way, Senator speaks very good Ilonggo. Nagulat ako. My office staff was so delighted. Sabi niya, when will she be able to vote for you daw? Sabi ko, ayaw ni Senator eh. Si Rose. Thank you to everyone. Thank you once again to Mr. Herman Mentong Laurel, Senator Nikki Cosseteng, Ana Malindog-Uy, and Ado Paglinawan. The recording of this session we will send to all our media friends and to all the participants and very eloquent resource speakers. Thank you to everyone. Have a
Thank
safe
you.
and healthy day.
I'll
Thank
see
you.
tomorrow. I hope I see you all
Yes.
tomorrow.
Tomorrow, 10
Thank
o'clock
you.
in the morning, please join Senator Cosseteng
Tomorrow,
tomorrow, 10 a.m. Public
Promote.
transport concerns. Please
Yes.
join, Senator, ha?
Really grabe.
Yes,
But
we'll
anyway-
invite you, Ana and Ado.
Yes.
And then,
Because of you, Wilson, I'm getting bashed. So that means it's
very
good.
good. Alam mo,
You're
people
doing
like you.
something great. Senator Nikki Cosseteng, if you're being bashed, it means you're making a dent.
Yes. Alam mo ba, lumabas na sa Inquirer yung 2 million peso bet ni Senator on the leaders. Magugulat kayo. Tomorrow, we'll discuss that again.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you so
Ado,
much to
thank you,
everyone.
Ana. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.